Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. We're going to completely bust the myth that authoritarianism just arrives overnight. We usually picture democratic collapse as this sudden, massive, violent event, right? Like a military coup or some overnight hostile takeover. But, well, history actually tells a very different story. Today, we are going to compare 5 collapsed international democracies with the historical stress tests of our very own U.S. system. By holding up these foreign case studies as a mirror to American history, we can see exactly how democracies actually fall apart, and honestly, what it takes to keep them together.
You know, this reality of democratic collapse is a lot like the old frog in boiling water analogy. There's this incredible quote from a Berlin school teacher reflecting back on 1934, and it shows us that people don't wait around for one massive, shocking occasion to resist. Instead, they're just sort of lulled into compliance. It's the slow, creeping accumulation of small surrenders. Each little step is individually defensible, or at least kind of easy to ignore, but collectively, they are fatal. And if we fast forward from 1930s Germany all the way to modern Hungary, we see the exact same erosion happening step by step. Freedom is just legally and gradually normalized away. Martin Gulyas, who is a journalist who watched independent media get swallowed up in Hungary, basically echoes the exact same sentiment as that Berlin schoolteacher nearly a century earlier. The fact that we see this observation across entirely different countries and decades tells us something absolutely crucial. This isn't just a cultural phenomenon, it's a universal psychological playbook. So, we're going to map this playbook out across 4 key areas today. First, weaponizing the law. Second, scapegoats and enemies. Third, unchecked impunity. And finally, when guardrails are tested. We'll compare those international historical examples directly with the moments when American guardrails were pushed to the absolute brink.
Let's move to our first theme, weaponizing the law and the legality of illegality. It's a pretty chilling reality that constitutional tools are very often used illegally to dismantle democracy itself.
Because Hitler was an elected dictator, he actually used existing laws to legally strip away democratic rights over a matter of mere months. Just looking at the timeline, in January 1933, he was appointed chancellor entirely legally. By February, he used the Reichstag fire decree to suspend civil liberties. By March, Parliament legally voted to pass the Enabling Act, which gave him the power to rule by decree. Literally every single step was technically legal under German law at the time. It teaches us a terrifying lesson. Legality and legitimacy are not always the same thing.
Which brings us to modern autocratization. If you look at Viktor Orbán's Hungary, it relies heavily on technically legal maneuvers, things like rewriting the constitution and packing courts, rather than sudden military coups. Orbán won a completely legitimate election in 2010. But then, he used his majority to change electoral districts, lower the retirement age of judges so he could force in his own loyalists, and legally consolidate media ownership. It maintains the appearance of a democracy, right? I mean, they still hold elections, but the playing field is so tilted that meaningful competition is essentially eliminated.
Turning to our own American mirror, early stress tests like the Sedition Act of 1798 proved that constitutional protections, even things like the First Amendment, have never been absolute. They require active defense. Just as Orbán rapidly changed foundational laws to weaken his opposition, early American leaders passed the Alien and Sedition Acts to literally criminalize publishing malicious writing against the government. Editors of opposition newspapers were actually thrown in prison. It shows us that simply having a constitution written down on a piece of paper doesn't magically protect you. People have to actually enforce those protections.
And we see that both foreign autocracies and revered American presidents like Abraham Lincoln have used emergencies to suspend core rights. This raises a really difficult question. Where does legitimate emergency power end and authoritarian abuse begin? The Weimar Constitution had Article 48, which allowed emergency rule and was ultimately weaponized. In the U.S., Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War, which allowed civilians to be detained indefinitely without a trial. He even ignored the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who ruled it unconstitutional. Emergency conditions always change what leaders claim is constitutional, and defining that boundary is incredibly tough.
Moving right along to Theme 2, Scapegoats and Internal Enemies, or Purging the Coalition. This is where we examine exactly how regimes consolidate power by identifying an enemy within to justify suspending normal rules.
There's a fascinating and honestly terrifying pattern here. Broad revolutionary coalitions quickly narrow down, and former allies become the new targets of terror. Just look at Iran. Secular leftists, feminists, and liberals marched right alongside Khomeini to overthrow the Shah. But once he was in power, Khomeini instituted his theocratic rule, and those exact same allies were pushed out, arrested, or worse. The quote-unquote named threat is usually just a smokescreen to eliminate anyone who might challenge the new ruling clique.
In the U.S., our own government targeted internal scapegoats during World War II, incarcerating 120,000 Japanese Americans, and they did this with the full approval of the Supreme Court and public opinion. Following Pearl Harbor, people were forced into converted horse stalls and isolated camps without a single charge of disloyalty or espionage ever being filed. And here's the absolute biggest takeaway from this. The Supreme Court upheld it in Korematsu v. United States. Majorities can be wrong. Extremely popular presidents can be wrong. This is the structural case for why democracies absolutely must protect minority rights independent of majority will.
Now, Stalin used brutal show trials, extracting false confessions through torture and threatening people's family members. But the U.S. experienced its own brand of demagoguery during the Red Scare. Senator Joseph McCarthy used televised hearings to accuse hundreds of people of communist sympathies with zero evidence. Entire careers were ruined strictly on the basis of rumor and association. It was a classic authoritarian tactic operating right inside the Senate chamber, showing us that fear and accusation can thrive within democratic institutions for years.
Ultimately, McCarthy's unchecked power wasn't pierced by facts alone. It was pierced by a moment of raw, televised emotional truth and sheer individual courage. Joseph Welch, the chief counsel for the Army, asked McCarthy this simple human question on live television. After years of factual rebuttals totally failing to stop McCarthy, it was this moment of genuine grief and moral clarity that finally broke his spell over the American public.
Okay, theme 3, unchecked impunity, when the rules no longer apply. Let's look at the profound danger of political violence and abuse of power going completely unpunished. Because when people in power realize there are zero consequences, that cage door closes fast.
While Pinochet's U.S.-backed junta in Chile formalized impunity with 1978 amnesty laws, literally protecting the military from prosecution for torture and disappearances, the FBI's COINTELPRO operated secretly within our own democracy. It proved that authoritarian behavior absolutely can happen here, particularly against marginalized groups. The FBI secretly infiltrated and actively sabotaged civil rights organizations and black liberation groups for 15 solid years. Director J. Edgar Hoover even authorized operations to neutralize Martin Luther King Jr. This wasn't a dictatorship. This happened inside a formal democracy, directed at legal political organizing by U.S. citizens.
When leaders like Richard Nixon attempted to use the CIA and FBI against political opponents, our system faced a massive test of whether the president was truly above the law. In this famous smoking gun tape, you can literally hear Nixon authorizing a cover-up of the Watergate break-in, telling his chief of staff to use the CIA to tell the FBI to back off. He was using the state's intelligence apparatus to protect his own personal political interests.
But unlike in Pinochet's Chile, the American system actually held during Watergate. Why? Because the press, the judiciary, and Congress all functioned as vital independent checks. Investigative journalists exposed the cover-up, a judge ordered those tapes to be released, and crucially, there was a real bipartisan political will for impeachment. Nixon only resigned when his own party senators marched in and told him he had lost their support. The system held, for sure, but it wasn't automatic. It required institutions functioning exactly as they were designed to.
And that brings us to our final theme, when guardrails are tested. Let's analyze the ultimate stress test of our modern era and what actually keeps the democracy intact when everything is on the line.
Putting our institutions side by side with dismantled democracies really highlights how the U.S. has experienced severe wobbles in its own foundational pillars. In Hungary and Germany, courts were packed with loyalists. In the U.S., our courts have ranged from fully complicit, like upholding Japanese internment, to totally resilient, like forcing Nixon to hand over those tapes. Authoritarians tilt or end elections entirely, and the U.S. recently faced its own severe test regarding the certification of electoral results.
Reporting impartially from the historical record, January 6 represented an unprecedented violent interruption of the peaceful transfer of power, fueled by a narrative of a stolen election. A mob stormed the Capitol, the certification was delayed, and multiple investigations showed tremendous pressure was placed on state officials and the vice president to overturn the results.
So, what's the core takeaway here? Democracy doesn't just magically protect itself. It relies entirely on a combination of strong institutions and people willing to make courageous choices under immense pressure. Whether it's Joseph Welch standing up to McCarthy or independent courts defying a president, guardrails are not just laws written on a piece of paper. They are living, breathing mechanisms that require active maintenance by an engaged press, a fair judiciary, and leaders who prioritize the system over their own immediate political gain.
As that frog in the boiling water metaphor warned us earlier, we have to constantly watch out for the gradual normalization of the abnormal. Authoritarianism rarely announces itself with a sudden loud crash. It creeps in through legally passed laws, through the scapegoating of vulnerable minorities, and through the slow, quiet capture of independent media and courts.
I want to leave you with this final thought to consider. Looking at the autocrat's playbook, and then looking in the mirror of our own history, are our democratic guardrails more or less vulnerable today? We have survived severe stress tests before, but history shows us that survival is never guaranteed. It requires every single one of us to pay attention, to recognize the playbook, and to act before that cage door closes.